Okie doke. Welcome to my session uh, for Nodes of the Realm managing content access. And I just like to point out my lovely photoshopped picture on the right here. Um, Doth thee seeketh access. So let's move on to introductions. So my name is Jordan Thompson. I am a Drupal solutions lead at Northern Commerce. Northern Commerce is a digital web agency in London, Ontario, Canada. We specialize in marketing and consulting, and we make Drupal websites and e-commerce. And our Drupal websites, our main kind of categories, our verticals are um, higher education, government, hospitals, that kind of stuff. Um, I am currently a level 6 Drupaler. Um, so I've been in the Drupal game for about 6 years now. I've done quite a bit. I've been trying to keep up with my contributions as I go. Um, been to a few DrupalCons, presented at a few DrupalCons, in various camps. You can find me on Drupal.org at Nord102. And just to go over the agenda for today, we're going to talk about nodes, realms, and grants, rebuilding node access permissions, alternative access control, and access gotchas. And you can follow along if you want to see the PDF for this presentation at this bit.ly link here. So I'll just kind of give it a few seconds so people can grab that if they want. Okay, let's just get right into it, shall we? So node, realms, and grants. What are realms? So realms are strings that represent grouped access. So view, update, delete. Um, and they typically should be descriptive and specific to indicate the purpose of the grouped access. So whether or not it's going to allow, a user or a set of users to view a node, update a node, or delete a node, for example. Grouped access is tracked via a realm and a grant ID on a per node basis. And realms are stored in the node access database table. So just to show what that currently looks like out of the box. So we can see here that we have an ID of 0, a group ID of 0, a realm of all, and allows you to view everything. So by default, this is what you start your Drupal site with, is allowing you to kind of view everything. And there's not really any kind of real access control out of the box. And that node 0 and that group ID 0 just kind of is like apply to everything. It's the realm of everything. So something that we can actually do to create our own realms is, and our own kind of access control in here, is we can use a hook called hook node access records. So I have a code example here that kind of I'll walk you through kind of what we're doing. So on a per node basis, you can have the grants there, and in our situation, our scenario, we're going to actually have some content types, say, that have you have a permission to, you can only access your own content, but maybe we want to open that up on a per node basis. So we have a field called collaboration. It's like a Boolean. And if that's checked off, then we're going to allow other people to be able to edit, delete, update our node, view it. So you can see in here that, we're checking our node field data. If, that collaboration checkbox is checked, then we're creating our new grant. So we have a realm called collaborative, a GID of 0, and then we're granting kind of that view, that update, that delete for those people. So you can see if we say had 6 nodes and we check them off for all those, we would have our node IDs that, on the left there, our realms, and then we have our view, update, and delete all defined. So you can see how now this is kind of coming to life, and we'll kind of watch this table kind of change as we're going through, just to kind of keep track of what we can do, what the table looks like, and whatnot. So now getting into grants. So grants inform the node access system of which permissions the user actually has when they're attempting an action. So there is a hook called hook node grants. And when that's triggered, it actually then checks to see if the user has even been granted access to the realm and the grant ID. And if they do, then it checks to see if they can perform that action. So if that realm does include that action, so if that realm, has that view one, update one, delete one, then and they have access to it, then it'll allow them to do that action. But if that realm does not include that action, so there's a zero for there, it's actually denied. So not all realms obviously have to have a 111. They could be a mix of them. You could have different kind of tiers and whatnot. So a little code snippet for that is that this node grants, hook node grants here. So we have our grants, and we're currently doing this example by role. So just checking to see what the user role is. So whether you're an editor, a publisher, an administrator, and if you have one of those roles, it's going to grant you access to the collaborative realms. So then any node that has a realm defined for it, you can then access it if you're one of those users. So this does this action as noted on anytime you go to perform an action. So it's going to go, okay, I'm going to go view this node. I'm going to go edit this node. I'm going to delete this node. It runs this hook node grants, double checks that you should be in the group. You should have access to this realm. And if you do, then you can continue with your action. If you don't, access denied. So for example, we can see that nodes 1 through 6 here are in the collaborative realm, but you wouldn't necessarily have access to nodes 7 through 12 because they're in the confidential realm. So maybe they're private, and maybe only administrators or certain privileged users are able to edit, view, and delete those. Uh, So moving on to rebuilding node access permissions. So how do we rebuild those node access permissions? So when you're updating or adding realms in your hook node access records, the node permissions will need to be rebuilt. So those get tracked and kind of are stored um, when you create those. So the process of rebuilding those node access permissions kind of goes like the process of it is you have the entire database for the node access database table is truncated, so you just clear it all out and then you rebuild from scratch. So it's run for every single node, it processes it and kind of rechecks to make sure, okay, what are all the possible realms for my node and what are the different permissions for those. And you can actually find this node access permissions in under the reports status report node access permissions. And then there's a little link there that's called rebuild permissions that you can click, and then it'll run that batch process. Now, I'll note here that the more nodes you have, the longer this batch process is going to take. So it can take quite some time. For example, I have a site that I maintain that has at least over 300,000 records and nodes. So it takes quite a while to kind of rebuild all those if I were to do it all from scratch. Granted, not all of those nodes necessarily have realms that are applicable to them, but a good chunk of them do. So just a kind of some perspective there. There are also alternative rebuilding methods. So if you don't want to wait a really long time or you don't want to rebuild every single node permission, say you only changed, say, certain types. So you can, in your node access records, you could, certain types of nodes can have, certain bundles rather, can have their own realms. So maybe you only want to rebuild the permissions for a subset. So some alternative methods, you can save those nodes individually and manually. It's not really the best, but that's our quote unquote good solution. The better is if you save it in kind of chunks, so you can kind of select the page you're currently on your content overview, and run a save. And then the best would actually be using views bulk operations, so you can kind of select all of them. Now, this is very helpful for doing the subset. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the best solution. Like, it is the best solution out of these alternatives, but the node rebuild is the best you can get. But if you don't want to kind of wait as long and be very specific with what you're rebuilding, then using a views bulk operation is kind of your best bet. Now, going into alternative access control. So we've just talked about limiting access for nodes using the node access records and the node access grants. But what if we kind of want to try something different? What if we don't want to do just nodes? What if we want to do other kind of entities? So we do have access to do something like that, pun intended. We have a hooked entity access and a hooked entity type access hooks. So those allow the ability for control access for non-node entities such as custom entities, media, files, any kinds of things, users, and I have a code snippet here just to show. So what we can do in this snippet here is by default we're going to default to neutral so that it'll take whatever the permissions are, say on the permission global scale, um, for that neutral result, and then we can go in, say we get the entity type, say it's media in our example. We check if we want to view it, we want to update it, we want to delete it. Maybe there's certain conditions that we want to do. There are scenarios where I've done some examples that are pretty cool. Is that if you're doing checks on media access, you can actually then check what node the media is uploaded to, or being referenced by rather. And similar to if a file is uploaded directly to a node, you can then check the usage or the reference of who's referencing it, or who's like the file usage for that file, to then grab the node, and then you can then run a node access check. And then if they have access to the node, then they should have access to, say, the media on the node, for example. So in a case as well is that, certain times we have private files, right? So we have private files that typically are only going to be viewed by the user that uploaded them. But what if we wanted to allow other users to view those private files as long as they had access to the node that it was uploaded to? So just kind of a neat way you can do that kind of stuff. Another code example I have here, slightly different, more or less the same, is that hook entity type access. So that will allow you to um, check on any kind of entity types you want. In my example, we're using node, but this could be media, this could be file, user, and then you can have your kind of conditions on a per operation basis. Some other alternative access control that you can use is actually denying access to nodes. So a use case for that is if you want to reference content without actually having the ability to view, update, or delete the content. So it would require granting access, but then denying it in a hook. A scenario for this is that the node that you want to give someone access to is then referencing other content, but you don't want to give them access to that other content. I know it's kind of like maybe a little more specific, but you want to make sure that they can actually then save that content without running into errors. Because if they don't have access to the reference content or some type of access, then it'll actually kind of prevent them from saving, because it'll say like, I can't recognize that content because you don't have access to it. So it's kind of like a limited access, if you will. Another example you could do is leveraging entity references for node access. So if you say you specified the node ID for the grant ID instead of the user ID, you could see if the user has an entity reference to a node, um, then you're granted access. Or, for example, you could have if this node references a different node and then a user references that kind of middleman node, if you will. If they're both referencing the same thing, then give them access to that other the other node, if that makes sense. So there's different kinds of scenarios that you can work with, as long as you are kind of making those business rules of saying like this realm is going to be used for kind of a reference style access as opposed to the kind of the traditional style. Then you could totally do that. And a few access gotchas. Um, Understanding the concept of node access can actually take some time, and that's okay. I know that when I started going into this and kind of going really deep in the weeds, it is kind of confusing that like the kind of even the difference between a realm and a grant, and that you're granting access, but sometimes the grants could grant you to a realm that only has limited access. So even the wording can be a little confusing. Um, and the fact that multiple realms could apply to the same node, and the grants happen when someone goes to perform an action, so those are more real time, whereas the node permissions are kind of like a set kind of guideline that is there for when something goes to get accessed. So it can be a little confusing, but kind of start small. Don't get super crazy with some of the examples I mentioned, like allowing access to a node if you have or to the media if you have access to the node, for example. But you can start small and just say like, if there's a checkbox on something, like in my example there, then other users can have access to it, and then kind of we'll go from there and kind of expand yourself. So I really started small and then kind of kept adding to it, and I was like, okay, I need access to the node, do access to the nodes. Now I need access to the things on the node, so the media, the files. So I was doing that and kind of just keep iterating and finding new hooks, finding things that work. Um, Another note is realms and grants do not deny, they're only for granting access. So in my example there, we can grant access with those realms and grants, but then we can deny access with, say, the hook entity access or the hook entity type access. Um, so it's just really important to know that grants are for granting, which is in their name. But sometimes it's easy to kind of forget, like, if I wanted to deny someone, it's like the lack of grant, or if I wanted to deny them, I can deny them in a different kind of hook. Um, Grants can conflict with how the site permissions are configured. So, they might kind of clash if you're trying to allow all the users to have access, but then you're trying to then grant certain users access or deny access for users. So typically, you'd kind of want to clear those permissions and then only really grant them on a per node basis, um, as opposed to kind of because the permissions will only really apply across the board, right? So if you're doing that, then the grants are going to be trying to give you permissions that you might technically already have, and then you're really not benefiting from the realms and the grants like you should be, if that makes sense. Now, something else that is important to think about as well is that node access checks will apply for all access checks. For example, when someone's viewing view results or anything like that, but entity access hooks will not. So that's kind of just an important way of when certain things get triggered. Um, so, for example, if you had a view, say you had a view that you were showing to two different users, those results might vary based on which nodes they have access to, right? So it could be the same view, and you could reuse that for multiple users. So, for example, you could have a dashboard that shows um, a listing of nodes, but it's kind of specialized on what a user has access to without having to do any kind of like query altering or anything specific or anything kind of contextual, because the node access will inherently check that. So it'll say, say I have 50 results, but you only have access to 30 of them. So I'm only going to show you 30. Um, so just kind of an interesting little tip on that. Um, some other gotchas include node access permissions always need to be rebuilt when adding or updating realms. Because remember, those realms kind of need to be registered into that node access database table. So if they're not registered, then they're never going to be acted upon. The grants aren't going to be triggered when someone goes to view that node or edit that node or delete that node. Now, uh, inversely, when you add a new grant, you don't need to rebuild those access permissions because you're not registering anything new. You're just kind of adding a new trigger. So when something is triggered, when an action is triggered, it'll then maybe do another check or do some other kind of uh, functionality in the back end to see if that user should have access to that action or access to that realm and see. So that's really the big difference is the node access records is kind of the registration of these are the defined rules and like groupings, if you will, and then the grants on a per node basis will say on a per node and like per action even. Um, it'll allow you to kind of make sure that you have access to those or not. Something very, very, very key. I should have bolded the whole line here. Is always make sure that your node access permissions rebuild and it fully finishes and it's not interrupted. I have run into this in the past, and that's why it's a very big gotcha. Is that since they're cleared out and they're rebuilt from scratch, if you somehow were to have that interrupted or it doesn't finish fully, then you're going to have some of your nodes have access control and some of your nodes won't. So then it's kind of like a free for all, or it's kind of falling back to your global permissions, and that might cause unexpected behavior because now instead of people having access to those 30 that they should be seeing, now in that example with their view, now their access they can see everything, things that they shouldn't be seeing, and then kind of chaos. So that's something really important, and that kind of comes back to how long that batch process takes. So, if you don't want to, if you don't have time or you don't have like the resources to have something open for, hours because you have too many nodes, maybe it's better to do kind of that views bulk operation to do that subset. So maybe you only added a new hook node access record for a subset. So say if they're a certain content type and you only need that one content type rebuilt, then that's maybe your go-to as opposed to re-rolling everything. Um, just to make sure that it finishes, it's all updated, and yeah. I also would another gotcha, I guess, in here. It's not really a gotcha, but more like a some of this stuff can be hard to test sometimes, um, and making sure that these things are being fired and triggered. But knowing where it is in the database is important, and you can run your like Kint or Devel in the hook node grants, so you can see if people are getting access or not. Even just throwing in um, like yeah, different kinds of conditions or checkpoints there can always help. And then when you're running, say, your hook entity access, even just throwing in like access denied, just just in there, just to make sure that you're even getting in there, because sometimes you might not know if it's actually checking anything or not. So some kind of is just important things to consider. And that's everything. Now, I'm definitely open. We have some time for questions and comments. So I don't know if those are going to come through the chat or not, or kind of facilitated through the chat from real life. So please feel free to ask questions. Um, I know this is a topic that can be really cool, but like kind of like really in the weeds. So happy to answer any questions. I'm also picturing a big applause for those that are in Colorado right now. And hopefully I didn't lose anyone along the way. Are there any audience questions? Shink? Yeah, I can send the link to the presentation. Actually, what I can do, I'll put it in chat here, and then I'll also just kind of go back to the slide that we had it on, just so the everyone can kind of see. I will say too, just kind of like rambling on. I feel like the possibilities of like what kind of things you can leverage to control different kinds of access are kind of endless. Not to be like cliche, but you can kind of really go nuts with it. Um, and like seeing if certain as kind of know, I think the one really cool one is like if someone has access to the node that's referencing a media or that has a file, then they have access then inherently to that. Another example too um, is that say we have two users that need to be able to access the same things, but those files and stuff, then yeah, it allows that ability to kind of share a pool base, regardless of who's uploading those files or anything like that, which I think is really neat. So it really allows people to kind of have those smaller pools, if you will. So it's not even necessarily like you could consider maybe like, oh yeah, like maybe you could do something like this with groups. You can have oh well, let me finish my thought and then I'll answer this question. Um, well, you could have groups like group access for sure, but then it's still kind of everywhere. Like it's all the nodes in a group. And then again, you could maybe do like a workbench access. So you could have, certain roles or users. But again, that really, it does work, but it might not necessarily work for your more complicated solutions. It does work, but it's not necessarily a one size fits all solution. So, question in the chat here. One issue I've encountered is phantom nodes, where if I delete, say, an image, it would still show as being live on the site. Um, delete, say, an image. When you mean like when you delete an image, it's still like accessible? Or maybe I just don't know what I mean. Maybe need clarification on what like being live on the site is. Like still accessible by like users? I would say it's appearing in 5 places, but yet is deleted from the media library, not accessible by users. Hmm, that is interesting. Um, Deleted from the media library. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what would necessarily cause that. Um, yeah, that's a good point. So someone just to put in the chat here, someone said it could be because it's referenced by revisions. So yeah, like because technically it's in the history, so it's technically um, referenced by different things, but not the current version. And maybe that could be some kind of confusion. Yeah, like it's kind of like a weird scenario where like it was at one point, but not anymore. But you think maybe like that active usage could differentiate between a revision and a current version, but I guess there's not like saying like, um, what if someone wants to revert when it did have that image? Yeah, yeah, it's true. Like, yeah, if you were to revert and you had deleted that media because you think it's not being referenced by anything, then I don't know if it would error necessarily, but it would probably like just be missing content at that point. So yeah, I guess something that might not necessarily be obvious with, which could maybe be a gotcha with these node access permissions is having like an explicit list of users that have access to something. Whereas, for example, if you're using Workbench access, in theory, you could see what roles or what users have access to a certain like editorial group. But with this, it's not necessarily obvious who has access. In certain cases, though, that might not matter. You're just saying like maybe I have thousands of users, and I just need to make sure that whoever they are, they have the right access control, and it doesn't really matter. But it doesn't necessarily lend itself to saying like, oh, I need to know all of these people. Granted, if you were using other methods, so say granting node access based on an entity reference, you could then infer that if someone's referencing X entity, then they then fall into this like access control group, if you will. So I suppose there are ways to do it depending on how you're doing your access control. Are there any other questions, comments? Anyone have a count of how many times I've said the word access?